What's up, grinders? So today we're going to do another review. This time we're looking at the myth of input, how not to learn a language. This one was sent to me via Discord. If you guys don't know, I have a Discord server. You can join us in the pinned comment below. We talk everything to do with languages there. We have language channels, random channels, meme channels, shitposting. The whole works happens pretty much there. You are more than welcome to join if you just want to be kept in check on your language learning journey. Now, I was sent this video, and as a tiny bit of research, I always do about 10 seconds of research. I noticed that there was other response videos to this by much larger language learning YouTubers who are a lot more important than me, graceful than me, beautiful than me, but I figured, you know what, I'm going to come in and take this one on because this was actually released by an Australian. And as you know, there's about 4 people in Australia, so I've never met this guy before, so we're going to do a review.
Anyone who has tried to learn a language knows that there are a million different learning systems and methods out there, and a million different people trying to sell them to you.
Well, he's not wrong about that so far.
But after a while, you will probably notice one idea that everybody seems to believe in, and that is the importance of input. Sometimes entire learning programs are based only on providing input.
And I guess before we jump into this, the problem is people have a really hard time defining what exactly they mean by input. Now, it sounds like a really obvious term. Well, obviously, input is you watch something, you hear it, therefore it's input. But even the fact that you speak words, when you perform and speak words, you are doing another form of input because you're hearing your own voice come back at you. So realistically, depending on how you want to take the meaning and stretch it, it can cover literally everything you do as a form of input because you do it and then you get feedback instantly based on how you did it. So I guess what he's probably talking about here is input in the sense of just listening to content, not input as in instant feedback to your own voice, to basically the reactions of people around you, stuff like that.
And on the idea that input is the only thing you need to learn a language. The main reason this...
If you want an example of a system that talks about basically only input to learn a language, like a good example, I would say is Dreaming Spanish. Although technically, based on this, it doesn't quite just use that because later on they do bring in speech, obviously, because eventually you're going to want to speak the language. But it is a vastly majority input-only system, as in you just listen and watch content.
Idea is so powerful is due to the influence of one man, Stephen Krashen, who is often viewed as a legendary figure in the world of language learning.
You know, this is an interesting thing for me. A lot of people, they will look up to other people and they'll always refer back to them and, you know, this person, he said this and, you know, he's done these studies and stuff. I'm the type of person where I don't give a shit who you are. If it doesn't seem logical to me or it's not reflected in my experiences in teaching, yes, I've taught for like 10 years at one point, teaching English, teaching every type of person you could imagine. I also taught Esperanto for many, many years. So if it's not reflected in my actual experiences where I've tried and tested these systems, I don't care what you say. I'm just going to call it out.
He proposed the input hypothesis back in the 1970s, and his ideas have been enormously popular and very influential on the world of language learning during the last 50 years. And in 2021, you will still find him repeating his now famous mantra that we acquire language in only one way.
I will give it to this guy. He's a very good speaker. He's not using any filler words and he's really enunciating his words quite well, which is actually quite rare to see among YouTubers.
When we understand it. Here is Krashen in his own words.
The core contribution, I think, is that we acquire language in only one way, when we understand it. Most people call that comprehensible input. We don't acquire language when we speak. We don't acquire language when we study it. We don't acquire language when we memorize lists of verbs, etc., etc.
Now, here is something that he said that logically just does not fit for me, because he said we learn via input, we don't learn via speech, but speech is a form of input. If you ask any actor, and again, I did acting for many years before I became a programmer, we learn the vast majority of our monologues by speaking them over and over. We may use different methods along the way to like speed up that process, such as memory palaces and hooks and all this type of stuff. But at the end of the day, we learn them by talking them. Now, some actors will listen to the monologue, on an audio recording and then later on practice it, but that's not what the vast majority of actors do. So here we're getting input via speaking, and that's improving our monologue. Now, you might want to debate me and say, well, that's not what we mean by language learning, but learning a monologue is just learning a string of words and sentences together. And realistically, when you're learning a language, you're starting to learn how these things are stringed together.
We don't acquire language when we get corrected. All those things like...
See, I disagree with that as well, because if you use Anki, you are getting corrected and you learn language via doing that. So I don't disagree with the concept that we learn via input, but it depends what you mean by input. And here, he is now counting out those other things that I also include as input.
Grammar, vocabulary are the result of getting comprehensible input.
And again, if you're speaking those things and you know what they mean, then that is comprehensible and it is a form of input. You first output it, then you hear yourself as you output it.
It sounds great, right? No speaking, no study, just input. It's the dream of any language learner. There's just...
Okay, I can see already what his gripe is with what was just said then.
One little problem with the input hypothesis. It's total.
Okay, I hope he's got something to back that up with.
Now, I know this is dangerous ground because I am talking about a person that is highly respected and his ideas are the foundation of a lot of language learning programs. But I truly believe...
Now, obviously, at the end of the day, you want to trial things. It doesn't matter how respected someone is. Don't just believe it because that's what's said. Trial it out. Now, obviously, when we talk about science in general, you can't trial everything out. We have to, have some leeway in our belief systems. But for something like language learning, which is going to take a very long time, a big portion of your life, definitely trial out different things.
In the principle of error correction, created by the great sociolinguist William Labov, who said that a person who becomes aware of an idea with important consequences that has errors has an obligation to talk about those errors with the widest possible audience.
I don't agree with the obligation part right now, and I'm not sure exactly how this is related to language learning unless he's trying to state that he sees that there is an error within belief systems around language learning and therefore he is obligated to talk.
And because I think that the input hypothesis has errors and negatively affects millions of people trying to learn a language, I have an obligation to talk about it.
Okay, I should have just let him finish his sentence.
So, let's get specific. What exactly is the problem with the input hypothesis? The first problem is that the hypothesis can immediately be shown to be false by a specific but very common group of people called receptive bilinguals. They are people who have a highly proficient understanding of language, but they cannot speak or write it.
Okay, I understand what he's getting at now.
This situation is really common among the children of immigrants. The family moves to a new country and the parents continue to speak the language of the old country.
See, he hasn't got into it yet. But my issues with this type of belief system where all you need is input and nothing else is the fact that people take this, like what he's saying, so what the belief system is, you need input in order to learn a language is true. But output is just as crucial as input if you want to be able to utilize that language. Because even little children, we're talking babies, they don't just sit there silently, passively listening. No, as soon as they can form the most basic of sounds, they try to communicate. And then they get corrected via, their environment, by the reactions of their peers, the reactions of their parents. Just by the fact that they're not understood, they get corrections. And then they work those corrections into what they've learned about this language. Now, there have been plenty of studies that show even before a baby is able to physically make sounds, it's already trying to communicate. So the idea that we should just wait until we're already highly proficient in listening to a language before we speak would be the equivalent of a kid waiting until, a couple of years old before they start speaking. Most parents would be concerned at that stage.
But the children will adopt the language of the new country. And in that situation, it's common that the children will be able to perfectly understand the language of their parents, but will have a varying ability to express themselves. Now, you cannot argue that these children are not receiving comprehensible input. And not only is it comprehensible, but it is meaningful. It is input from their own parents.
I will say there's one caveat to this, and that is that children and adults alike, if they don't find the use for the thing that they're trying to learn, then they're not going to learn it. So for most children, it's not because they're not getting enough input and it's comprehensible. It's just due to the fact that they don't see a need for what they're hearing and listening to, and therefore they just filter it out and never actually learn it. So a child who learns their first native language, it's obvious why they learn that to fluency, because they literally have to. They cannot survive without that language. So that becomes the most crucial thing in their life. So when you learn a language, if you don't feel like this language that you're learning is crucial enough to pay attention, then you're not going to learn it, or at least you're not going to learn it well.
About their own life. Yet, some of these children cannot speak or write the language of their parents.
And I've actually got first-hand experience with this. So I've had to tutor multiple Chinese families with their kids as they live here in Australia. And inside the house, they speak Chinese perfectly fine. And then outside, they avoid making English friends just because they want to speak Chinese with everyone that they know. For them, even though they live in an English country, all the social media is in Chinese. Their friends that they've made now are in Chinese because there's a very big Chinese community here. They even go to schools where the teachers can speak Chinese. Their parents, family members, their community is all Chinese, and therefore they actually have a very hard time finding a use for English. Now, eventually they realize they're going to need this language, but they actually actively resist trying to learn this language. I've had these students actively resist, like, do we have to do this? Do we have to use English? Type of thing. It's actually quite strange because you're in a country where you would think they would definitely need to learn English.
And this is just one example of asymmetrical bilingualism. In fact, in general, bilingualism is misunderstood. It is extremely, extremely rare that people who speak 2 or more languages will have equal abilities in all of them. And even...
Well, of course, you're never going to have equal abilities in every language because you're going to use every language for a different scenario. Unless you're using it the exact same scenario with the exact same type of people talking about the exact same things, you're literally not going to have an equal amount in the language. And you couldn't even measure this if you wanted to anyway.
Even though this is a well-known fact and also totally natural, this creates a great deal of shame for some people who want to honor their parents and honor their culture through language.
This is interesting. I'm starting to look at this guy through the eyes of a teacher. Now, I say that because most like polyglot YouTubers and stuff online, they talk about languages. And by the way, I don't claim to be a polyglot. Most of these guys, they look at it from the perspective of like someone who has learnt languages, for pleasure, maybe for business or something like that, as opposed to having to actually teach a language, which is something that I've had to do for many, many years before I transitioned out of that.
But the fact that people do not have equal abilities in all their languages is not surprising to me at all, because
I don't think anyone would find that surprising. Like, is there someone out there who's claiming that? Like, I don't know where he's going with this.
I know something that everyone knows if they take a moment to reflect. You get good at what you practice. And
that is common sense.
That's why I have an obligation to talk about why this obsession with input is so dangerous.
Okay, I get the feeling that the direction that this is heading is that he's targeting those groups specifically that think all you need is input for like a very, very, very long time. And I understand that. Like it is stupid to think that you're going to make fast progress in a language by just sitting there and getting input. Now, again, at the end of the day, it depends what you want to do with the language. If all you care about is watching movies and you don't want to speak the language, then yeah, great. But from what I can see here, he's talking at this as the perspective of a teacher with the students, and obviously the students want to learn and possibly, most likely, speak the language.
Because it doesn't explain the full story. And I think mainly it's a problem of definitions.
Okay, I'm going to let him explain this in a second, but this is what my thoughts on this are. So Krashen's ideas are correct. However, is either he doesn't know how to enunciate his ideas correctly, because what he said earlier about input and, speaking not being a form of input is just completely incorrect. Like, that is obvious to anyone. When you do something, it is output, but then it becomes a form of input. I feel like that is completely obvious to anyone. So what's probably happened is people have taken this idea that input only means listening, and they've run with it. Now, I don't know if that's what Krashen himself actually believes, but based on that one clip, which was just there, I don't know how far out of context that was taken, but just that one clip there means in Krashen's eyes, speaking is not a form of input, which to me, it most definitely is. And error correction, I don't know why he said that's like not going to help you learn a language. Of course error correction helps you learn a language. Why would we go to school at all if we didn't need some form of error correction? Now, I know some people are going to say, well, that's because there's a kind of linguistic imperialism that's happening where we've set a standard for one language and now we want to pull everyone up to that, even though, there's many different ways to use the language. And I understand that perspective completely. However, that still does not negate the fact that error correction is highly important to improving your language. That's literally what Anki does. It's a tool used for error correction. Now, teachers are literally there as a form of error correction. And when you listen to something, if you say something and the person repeats it back to you corrected, you're getting error correction whether you're aware of it or not. And you may absorb that slowly over time. In fact, it is completely stupid to think that error correction plays no part in this, because if we did not get error correction, we would not learn at all.
First, let's ask two vital questions. One, what does it mean to acquire a language? And two, what do you want?
I have one beef with the term acquire a language, because what does it mean? You just get a language? To me, what they mean by acquire a language means that you've gotten so good at it that it's become instinctive. So you can acquire something by repetition. We do it all the time. For example, if we go back to programming, we can literally acquire programming by repeating it over and over and over until the point where it's just instinctive. We just type out the things. We don't have to think about the syntax and the rules and stuff like that. And it's the same with pretty much any skill set. You aren't really acquiring it. You've basically reviewed it so many times that it's now become instinctive. So I don't know why we need this specific term, acquire a language, when realistically, It's the same with any type of skill that we learn.
Okay, so first, what does it mean to acquire a language? If you define language acquisition, if you define knowing a language as being able to comprehend it and process it and understand it, then I suppose that the input hypothesis is correct. But that is hardly what most language learners want. It's not an accident that people call themselves English speakers or Japanese speakers.
I think he's got a very good point here. So, for example, if you look at Esperanto and you watch my Esperanto films, you will always see comments from people saying, wow, your fluency, you're so smooth, you're so fast, you sound so natural. And that's because I put an insane amount of hours into practicing my speaking. I literally non-stop practice speaking. And I would say that I did more speaking than I actually did of like listening input. Now, that is actually because at the time, there was not that many resources for me to listen to. Now, you could say I acquired the language via reading and stuff like that, and that's how I got my comprehensible input. But I challenge and say that actually a lot of it came from the fact that I built out so many different scenarios for myself, got error corrected on those scenarios through many different means, and practiced speaking a lot. So I think people really underestimate how much speaking actually helps with everything else. It's like a system that all works together. You need the listening, you need the speaking, and you don't technically need the writing or the reading, although it does help. It is another form of enforcing those systems overall. The reason I say you don't technically need it is because obviously throughout all of humanity, humans have had to listen and they've had to speak, but they have not had to write or read.
When they talk about their language abilities, the ability to speak, of course, is quite valued and, in my experience, considered a fundamental skill. I wonder how many learners would believe in a teacher that says, in my classroom, you will learn to acquire language, but not produce it. Let's do a thought experiment. So I sit down and I watch a video on YouTube from a surgeon that shows me how to perform brain surgery.
Okay, we all know where this is actually going. The guy's not just going to sit there and watch forever.
I totally comprehend the video and everything that the surgeon does. Have I?
Actually, you wouldn't. Now, this is another thing that's missed by a pure input methodology. It's because you can watch something and believe you understand everything. Like, let's say you're watching a brain surgeon, as he's mentioning right now. You see how the guy uses the tools, you see where he does the cuts, you see how he opens up the things. But until you use your own hands, and until you perform those gestures yourself, you will never actually truly be able to do that. Because realistically, when you look at the thing or when you're listening to the thing, you're getting a very overall image of how it all fits together. But when you actually perform the action yourself, well, then you really have to go into it. Now, this is where the input crowd will step in and say, yeah, but you had to see that before you could do it. You couldn't just wander into the room and start cutting open someone's head. And I totally agree. I am not against input at all. I am against the idea that you shouldn't do any form of output because, you know, it may affect your input, you may cause issues, but realistically, fossilization and stuff like this can be corrected later. And I also am against the idea that you shouldn't be doing equal amounts of output if, you know, speaking is actually crucial to you in the long run, because these things reinforce each other.
Acquired the knowledge of this operation? If not, how many videos would I need to watch before I acquired the knowledge?
You never would. You would have to eventually do the operation yourself.
Is that knowledge useful? And how many videos would I need to watch before you feel comfortable with me operating on your brain?
Now, some people might say, yeah, but you don't want to just step in there and start operating early before you've acquired sufficient knowledge. Well, that's where you have practice scenarios. And you can do the same thing with a language. If you're worried about, producing bad speech, then practice in a safe environment in your room by yourself where you can easily double check and error correct yourself. As you practice something, if you feel like you're making mistakes, you can always look it up. Or you could just literally get a tutor or someone who speaks the language to perform error correction for you.
But apart from that, think about how the idea of selling the importance of input discriminates against a majority of the world's languages. The fact is that most of the world's languages have never been written down, ever. But we have all become indoctrinated into the idea that recorded language is king.
Wait, I don't understand where this is going. This does not seem relevant to what was just being said. Because written language, although it is a form of input, how is this related to what we were just discussing?
That if it's written in a book, or recorded as a podcast, or put on television, then it is real language that needs to be digested.
Yeah, I'm not sure where he's going. I feel like he's conflating two separate ideas at the moment. Like, he's saying if a language is recorded, therefore it is important. And if it's not recorded, therefore people perceive it as not being important. Recorded as in, like, the voice, the sounds of the language have been recorded and put online. This, to me, is completely separate to, like, learning a language. Like, I don't see how this is relevant in any way.
And once you've done that, you have acquired the language. Well, apart from a tiny percent of languages on the planet, that attitude won't get you very far.
Okay, maybe what he's trying to get at here is that unless you're trying to learn one of the giants, you're not going to get enough input. Which does make sense. When I learned Esperanto, it was very difficult to get enough input en masse without producing my own input via, writing and practicing the language and doing things like that. Nowadays, that's not a problem. There's so much content for the language. And even when I was learning, there was a lot of written content. But for me, written content doesn't quite draw me like listening to podcasts and videos and stuff like that. So maybe that's what he's trying to get at. Although I feel like he did not mix these two ideas very well.
Apart from the fact that most languages produce hardly any output, so there is little or no input to digest, how will you ever use that language if you don't know how to speak it or write it? How do you think you will be accepted as a human being and a member of a community or a culture if you can't participate in the most fundamental of all human actions?
Again, this comes down to your need. If you have no need to talk, no need to speak, then clearly, why would you bother wasting your time doing that? So I just like to stress that because there will always be someone who will be like, yeah, but that's not what I want to do with the language. I understand. Everyone has a different need for the language. But in this scenario, moving forward, we're pretty much at the end of this video, but we will assume that you are a person who wants to speak the language, just to keep things simple.
Sharing. And maybe that's the part that upsets me most about the input hypothesis. It's not generous. It doesn't seek to contribute. It doesn't add anything. It just wants to suck on language like a parasite.
Okay, he has now completely and utterly lost me. I was in agreement for most of this video, where just doing input, if your goal is also to output, is a bad idea, because you should be practicing the skills that you actually want. But I have no idea how this idea around using a lot of input, which is taken over, like using the vast majority of your time or all of your time just for input, is actually some type of random parasite. Like the Borg of like language learning courses is just out here converting us all. I don't know where this is going.
That brings us to the second question, and by far the most important. What do you want? That is the first question that any good teacher asks.
He's 100% correct about that. What do you want to do with the language is the most important question.
And so it's also the first question that should be considered by any good teaching theory.
Not necessarily, because different teaching theories are aimed at different things. So you can't have a teaching theory that covers every single possible scenario. If you just want to watch movies, then obviously watch a lot of movies. Do an input-based, comprehensible input methodology, if that's all you care about. But even in that case, I would say use cards to improve, the number of words you can pick up to speed up the process. But you got to pick the methodology based on what you need to do. And there's going to be no one methodology which is perfect for every single scenario.
If you want only to acquire language, then please spend all of your time and energy on comprehensible input. But if you want to use language for the reason it was invented, communication, then you need to follow that basic logic of you get good at what you practice.
That is true.
If you want to get good at reading, read more. If you want to get good at speaking, speak more. If you want to get good at writing, write more. And getting good at all of those things will require years of hard work and a healthy dose of deliberate practice. Please don't let the promises of false prophets and prophets rob you of the gift of language, which isn't about understanding.
This is interesting. I saw a lot of reaction videos to this. I haven't watched the videos, but based on the thumbnails and titles, they were all saying this guy is completely wrong. But so far, I would say about 90% of what he said makes sense. There's nothing wrong with what he said. So I'm guessing there's probably going to be a lot of videos coming out about me teaching wrong or something like that. I don't understand what the problem is here. And he made some valid, good points. He got a little bit muddled around the end there with something, but I think what that muddling was about is the fact that there is a lot of predatory, learning, I guess, courses and stuff that exist out there, but realistically that exists in every single field, and you just got to use your two neurons that you got in your head to figure out what to do there.
Language, but about understanding other people and understanding yourself and making a contribution to society. Because now, more than ever, the world needs to hear what you have to say.
It was a good video overall. I'm actually curious to see what the comments say, because maybe that will give me an idea about what kind of, pushback he was getting. Okay, top comment. No input, nothing to output. Input accumulated to set deeply in mind and then goes out itself naturally as correct output stream. That's a load of crap right there. So, no output. Output is a form of input. Okay, I don't know why people don't understand this. This seems like common sense to me. If I'm saying something, I'm hearing myself say it. This is a form of input. Okay, let's look at the second one. There is one little problem with this gentleman's bold statement. Every single human who has ever existed and exists today has learned their own native language, at least the early stages, via comprehensible input. Yes, but every single person has also undergone error correction, as he mentioned in the video. They have also done a ton of output. There is no human today who is not doing output from literally a baby. You may not understand their output because it sounds like crap, or though to the parents it sounds like really cute and stuff, but you are doing output. So in summary, I think the issue is that so many people are forgetting the fact that output is a form of input. It's that simple. And if you output, you get input, but you also practice your output skills. But again, finally, for those who have not understood this, you should do what you want to do with the language, not just because he says something or I say something. If you want to just read, don't do anything else. If you want to just watch movies, fine, then just watch movies. But if you want to be a well-rounded individual, guess what? You're going to want to do all of it. That's pretty much it. I'll see you all in the next video, at which point I'm probably cancelled by the comprehensible input crowd. Now, I've noticed recently so many YouTubers like to end by just putting their hand in front of the camera, but that seems so, like, outdated. I'm going to try something different.